Hello, my name is Nick, and this is a PowerPoint presentation on my narrative analysis essay for my capstone in narrative studies class. The topic of my narrative analysis essay is on the video game Fire Emblem Three Houses. A bit of background on the game: Fire Emblem Three Houses is a tactical turn-based RPG created by Nintendo in 2019. It is the 16th game in the Fire Emblem franchise and was released on the Nintendo Switch. The game follows the character Byleth, a child of the mercenary named Geralt. While out on a mission, Byleth and Geralt come across a group of students from the Garreg Mach Monastery, an officers' academy and church of the continent of Foldland. They are ambushed by a group of bandits while training, and Byleth ends up saving the students and accompanies them back to the Garreg Mach Monastery. Once there, due to their bravery and recommendation by a knight who came to escort the students, Byleth is brought on as a teacher of the Officers' Academy. From there, the player picks one of three classes, or houses, to serve as head leader for, and train the students of that selected house in combat and academics. Depending on which house you pick, the story and characters you start with differ drastically, and post-time skip midway through the game, old friends could turn enemy on the battlefield as a great war begins. The narrative approach I want to explore and analyze in my paper is LGBTQ+ and gender representation as it is portrayed in Three Houses. To first approach this concept, I want to provide some background information on my paper, so I'll talk a bit about LGBTQ and gender as it relates to video games, as it relates to society as a whole, and finally, how these concepts are represented and presented in past Fire Emblem games in the series. After exploring some background concepts to give some context to the LGBTQ and gender representation in Three Houses, I then plan to use the majority of my paper to explore how these ideas are represented in Three Houses, both the good and the bad representation. I will also use the background information I stated earlier to explain why certain things in the game are the way they are, such as how societal norms affect the design of the game, or how Three Houses holds up in representation compared to other games in the Fire Emblem series. One of the main ways that I plan to explore LGBTQ+ representation in Three Houses is through the game's support mechanic. The support mechanic is a system in the game where when two characters are fighting next to each other on the battlefield or doing a task together, they can build support with one another. If the support is high enough, then they have the possibility of having a support conversation with one another. There can be 4 total support conversations that two characters can have together, being C support, B support, A support, and A+ or S support. Through these support conversations, things like a character's backstory, personality, or interests are explored. And in some instances, romance is also a topic and is usually reserved for the S support, while the A+ support is typically more platonic. As the player character, Byleth is able to marry almost any of the game's characters at the very end of the game, depending on the character's gender and sexuality. As well as LGBTQ+ analysis, the support conversation mechanic in-game is the best source of analysis for gender representation in Three Houses. More specifically, I want to explore the representation of female characters. Are they well written? Do they have more than just one-note personalities? Are they fleshed out characters with their own motives? Are they vital to the story, or do they just serve to be used as a source of development for male characters? Due to Three Houses also being a visual narrative, I plan to look at how character design is influenced in the game, and explore the differences of how the male characters are designed versus how the female characters are designed. And much like LGBTQ+ topics, I also will talk about how Three Houses stands against the rest of the Fire Emblem games in terms of gender representation. So the main issue that I'm having when writing this paper is I'm having trouble finding a good balance between background information and the actual analysis of Three Houses. The majority of the paper is meant to be about Three Houses, but I need to include some of the background information that I stated earlier, such as LGBTQ and gender issues in gaming and society. I don't want to end up taking too much of the paper to have to explain the background information, but I also don't want to leave too much out because it is needed to understand my approach for this analysis. I already cut class and unreliable narrator analysis from my paper out of fear of making it too long with the gender and LGBTQ studies, but I still have a lot in my P's, and I'm worried that it'll be too much and that it won't be about the actual game itself.